with OCSI. Some of you may know us, may have worked with us on the OPSI data packs, which I think there's some flyers for in your packs, and anyone wants a demo, then have a chat with my colleagues who are sitting in the middle over there, if you want to give us a wave. But today I kind of want to talk about something slightly different rather than data, and not so specific in terms of internet atlas. Just take a bit of a step back and talk about this idea of data engagement and what it means for local information systems and anyone else that provides data to a wide audience. At OCSI, we do a lot of collecting data, we do a lot of providing data and tidying it up, but we're also very heavy data users. We're very geeky when it comes about data. We love actually analysing the data, we love putting it out in reports, and we love it when people take our reports and actually kind of find it interesting and useful, as I'm sure a lot of you do as well. So there's this idea of data engagement kind of takes this forward. So I'm going to just go over today, what is this? What is data engagement? It's a fairly vague term. And how can it be done? What can you do to sort of get people interested in data and take it forwards? And I'll just go through some examples really. So the idea of data engagement, it's a fairly fluffy term, I have to admit. But it came out of a conference here in London a couple of weeks back called UK GovCamp, which has been running a couple of years and has a few hundred people attending. And we had an interesting discussion in one session on this idea of data engagement and how to get data out there. And some of the definitions that people came up with, including the head of data.gov.uk, were about this idea of actively engaging to ensure that information and data can be used in a wide range of ways. And the important point, I think, is the second quote of getting beyond simply publishing the data sets and really helping support people to use the data for this end goal of creating social, economic and administrative change. And you can't quite see the URL there, but that's j.mp/data_stars. And if you want to go and read more about this, I really recommend that. We'll come back to this idea. But that's still quite a vague definition, I think. It doesn't really help people that think you guys putting the slides together. So I kind of wanted to delve into it a bit more by going back to my own childhood. Not quite this long ago, I have to admit. This is actually Putney Library in the 1960s, where my dad worked for a bit, and he's always been a librarian, and I've always grown up in and around libraries during opening time and after closing hours. And so I've always grown up with this idea that libraries are places that you go for books, yes, and if you ask somebody what a library is, it's a place where books are kept. But having lived within libraries, there's a real kind of sense of taking the books forwards and really kind of getting people to do more than just take books out. There are various events, lots of supporting information, there's lots of feedback around what books should we get, etc., lots of suggested reading. And there's also a lot of internal organisations. I don't know if you remember the little paper cards catalogues that you can flick through and you can find the book you want and go and look it up in the Dewey Decimal System on the shelves. So there's a lot of work there, and really sort of the role of the library is to sort of tie all that together. And it wasn't until I grew up really and sort of certainly with the recent cuts and stuff like that and local library closures that I realised it wasn't just me that loved this idea of libraries. It was pretty much everybody, to the extent that you get a Twitter hashtag I love my library at the top there. So there's a real sense of the library's place in society. And I think there are two main interesting points to take from that are they have obviously a lot of different content, they have a lot of different books and a lot of different, not just books, they have audio, etc. And they have to kind of match that up to a lot of different users as well. So from out of that, they have to kind of be quite creative and be very efficient at finding ways to find the data, suggest the data, and help people to use the data. And I think that's the same challenge that open information systems are kind of facing now, is really to sort of provide that extra value to people that are interested in using the data. And this is an area that seems to be expanding quite rapidly as well. So there's with the open data agenda and various new tools that can open data up. So you've got things like Google spreadsheets, etc. We're seeing a lot of new users and a lot of new audiences that are coming to LISs to try and find data. And it was interesting at Rochdale last week, quite a few people, I think there were 3 or 4 mentions of journalists getting in touch with their LIS team to actually find out how to use Internet Atlas and find out what the data means. It's just another example of new people coming in and asking questions. But with this, it can get quite confusing quite quickly. There's a lot of, as we've already heard this morning, there's a lot of different users, all with their own different needs, their different backgrounds, different questions, even different language. They kind of have to be handheld in terms of working out what they're actually after and what they can understand. So the challenge is, how do we actually go about thinking about this in a clear and structured way so that we can actually approach it methodically and also make it clear what we're doing in terms of making it that way. And ultimately address the question, what role can and should LISs play in terms of audience and functionality. So to go back to the UK GovCamp conversation, what came out of that the next day was a few people had a chat and they decided that the idea of a charter of engagement would be a useful structure for really thinking about the issues. And they came up with a 5-star system as a sort of way of rating your level of engagement. So the first star was just to be demand driven in terms of which data you're using, which data people find useful. The second star was about providing metadata and context to that data and helping people understand it. The 3 stars was around supporting the conversation, so actually the network around the data itself. And then the 4th star was being able to support people doing stuff with the data and supporting storage capacity. And then finally, the 5th star was completing the feedback loop around data collaboration and taking data and improving the data through the networks that are available. For me, I think the idea of stars can be a little bit confusing as well. I prefer to think of it in terms of more of a life cycle of data. So all the stages that data goes through and how people can be involved in that and what that means for people. So to map that across, we've got in the first stage just choosing the data and sort of seeing what's useful. Second step, we're helping to understand the data, so clarity, metadata, etc. And then the third stage, helping to talk about the data, as I said, and then helping to do things with the data and really make it applicable and applied. And then finally, just helping to improve the data, which is quite a kind of slightly more advanced step, I think, but certainly worth having as an end goal, just to bring everything back. So I just want to go through each of those and just give some examples and give some possible tips. I think a lot of you will all be doing some of this already, and certainly everyone does this at a sort of almost subconscious level, I think. There's always that end goal in your mind, but having a framework to actually put all of these ideas into really helps in terms of mapping out what you're thinking of doing already and where else you can improve it. So to start off, just to look at choosing data, fairly simple. What information do people need to make their decisions right now? I've just put the first 2 points: anticipate needs and get involved in discussions. And they're fairly general points throughout this whole thing, I think, is some of this is really around seeing what discussions are out there and going out there and finding out, I think. And that's really important. Anticipating needs, some of it will be very topical, some of it will be very thematic about what's important to people right now, depending on who you're talking to as well, I suspect. And they're quite, they're not so technical approaches, but they are very useful. And I'll come back to those in a moment, actually. On the more technical side of things, using website analytics, we've already heard about Google Analytics this morning, very useful information. Also things like search metrics, what are people actually looking for? There's quite a few internet users that have their search box on the home page at the moment, which is really good to see. There's a lot that can be done around seeing what people are searching for. So, for instance, this is data for AR.net, which some of you might know that we run. And we've got a very simple search term box on the front page there, and this is just a back-end page that lets us see what the most popular search terms are recently and all the time, just so that we can get a feel of what topics people are interested in, and we can sort of make sure that we're feeding back on that. To return to actually getting out there and having conversations, this is another example of some work we've done recently at IAUC, called Data Bridge, with a lady called Jo Ivans down in Brighton. And we actually went out and worked with a charity called Amaze, who look at children with disabilities and service take-up. And by working with the charity, we came to a much better understanding of what data they had and what data they understood, and certainly in terms of what they thought they could do with it versus what we thought they could do with it. And so some really interesting findings came out of that. We produced some data for them, produced some reports for them. We also produced a little tool on the side to help them with some postcode lookups. And yes, just a very interesting conversation, I think. Other tips, we just help in terms of providing resources that people can use, so signposting to other data sources and other useful tips and things like that. And also just can people get in touch with you to find out where something is, so if you think of when you go to the library, and yes, you can find books one way or another, but sometimes you just want to go up to somebody and really say, have you got this book? And they can take you over to it. And it's just about being very simple and being very open about letting people get in touch with you. So, moving on to the second stage then, helping to understand the data. Again, so the first point is just get out on the road. I know quite a few internet users are very good at coming up with personas and user acceptance testing. A lot of people go through internal testing, a lot of people get testers in, and I think that's a really valuable exercise to go through. It's definitely worth doing, and I think you can do this fairly cheaply as well. But I think there are ways of doing this which don't involve thousands of users. Other slightly more technical tips: is the metadata either accessible and clear? Is there any information available on the frequency of data updates, format reliability concerns? Can people find that information quickly and easily if they want to know it? It might just be a list of recent updates on a page or something like that. So it's just about making it accessible. Could there be a glossary of guides to data? And I think really importantly, are there any other examples of the data being used around as well? Because that helps to provide a different context for which people can really understand what the data does and what it means. I think that's vital. So third step, helping to talk about data really kind of comes on naturally from the last one, I think. Again, go to the conversation. What existing user groups are there? I know, for instance, the West Midlands Regional Observatory, which hasn't been updated in a while. I think it's been sold off, but they have a very good list of links to local groups and local data groups, and all of the minutes from their meetings. So it's a real way to build up the the interests of the community around that, I think. To come down to more concrete tips, how shareable is the data? So is the data all hyperlinkable? Can people actually get to it without having to click through 3 screens of text? Some simple stuff, could you put in share this buttons? There's lots of services that provide little buttons to kind of just let you Twitter something or send it to Facebook or whatever. We've already heard how useful email alerts are earlier. And news items and blog posts. Again, just a way of really providing stuff that people can share. So with email alerts, people can forward that on. With news items, they can send the link around, they can provide commentary on it, etc. It's just really kind of giving people hooks and ways in to spread that data. And following on from that, are you being open? Can users comment at the sites? Can they reply to each other? And that really starts to get at the idea of starting to foster a community around the data and really see what people are saying about it. Going on from that, the 4th step about actually using data, I put lead by example really as the first point and on its own slide because I think it's really important to show as data providers just what can be done with it, I think. So I've got an example from, this is a report from Warwickshire Observatory, who is worth checking out. And they've just got a few simple graphs on the left, but I think really importantly on the right-hand side they've actually shown you how they've worked out the data, and they've got a lot of notes on what the quality of the data and any concerns they have over the reliability. So it's really just there, available for you to have a look at. And then they've got the link in the top right, up there, just so you can then go back to see the original data as well. And that's something you can then post on the site and again give people hooks in to share, I think. Other things you can do, show examples of used again. So come back to the reports and the idea of news articles, especially with the journalists getting in touch. Even if there might be certain apps that are coming out that you can show off and show good people some inspiration about how to use the data. And finally on this one, just providing links to resources and support, whether that's local information, national information, or even just general information around how to use data generally, so to improve the visualization site that we did there about how to best ways of visualizing data. And finally, the big question of then helping to improve the data and getting feedback from users starts to open up bigger questions such as what is missing, why is it missing, how could it be added, because obviously it ties in with existing processes around data quality. And really just get back at that question of what do people still need, what are they missing, what do they still need for this kind of social, economic and administrative change. So that's kind of a quick run through really, and it's really in its early stages as a framework, but it does just start to, I think, lay out, it's a guide for laying out activities, and it gives you some ideas, and that can be taken forwards, but within certain bounds. And it really starts to break the complex area down into something that you can understand internally, something you can advertise to other people, and lets you just work out what's important to you and where you can go next, really. So hopefully that's of use.